Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this show, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight into what goes on around the Capitol and the people who are involved in the process of government. Our guests today are a couple of folks who are involved in government in a different way, as reporters, as the public's eyesight and earshot as to what's going on in the government process. We've got David Steeves, who's from the Statesman Journal, and Annie Athon. And I just mispronounced it. It should have been Athon from the Statesman Journal. I'm going to learn your name since I've never really called you anything but Annie before. Anyway, welcome to Capital Insight.
Thank you.
Now, both of you are reporters for the Statesman Journal. You're there representing our Capitol's newspaper and covering events. But before we talk about what goes on at the Capitol, I thought I'd get a little bit of information about you as people, because folks often don't hear about reporters from anything other than seeing the name in the newspaper. We'll start with you, David. What's your background? Where are you from?
Okay, I grew up in the Tacoma area up in Washington State. Went to school there at Pacific Lutheran University. Spent a couple years after graduation doing temporary stints or internships with papers in Seattle, Tacoma. Covered the Washington legislature in '87, and then I came to Salem to work for the Statesman in '88. I've been here since then covering education, general assignment, and I began covering the Capitol in 1991. So this is my third session.
And Annie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in Northern California and went to school at Berkeley. Majored in English and French literature, and then took some time off and played in Europe. Went back to graduate school and got a master's in journalism from Northwestern, and did some time in Washington, D.C. through Northwestern's program, and then worked for the Oakland Tribune and the Contra Costa Times in the Bay Area, and then came to Oregon when I married a native Oregonian and been with the Statesman Journal almost 4 years.
Now, for each of you, I'm really curious, and I'll start with you, David, on this one. What brought you to journalism?
Actually, I was a senior year in high school. I was trying to take it real easy, dropped my physics class, and decided journalism was the best slacker class I could take for sixth period, and I really loved it. It was exciting. I enjoyed the instant turnaround of putting something together and having it in the paper real quickly, and daily journalism was great for that. And pursued it in college. It just reaffirmed my desire to pursue a career in journalism, and I've been doing that ever since.
How about you, Annie?
I kind of came about it in a more circuitous route. I had always wanted to go to law school, and until I graduated from college, I always thought that was what I was going to do, but I always liked to write. I wanted to go to law school so I could make a lot of money to write books. That was always my motive. And when I was in Europe, I actually was doing a lot of writing in my journal and just kind of decided I didn't really want to go to law school. I wanted to do something that I could write every day, you know, for my profession. So since nobody was going to pay me to write the next great American novel, I decided journalism was a good way to do that. And also at one time had thoughts of working internationally, and it was something that I could use my French with, you know, possibly someday to be a foreign correspondent. So that's how I got into it, and I love it too. Once you get into it, it's almost addicting, and the pace is so fast, and it's on to one thing and on to the next.
Would it be fair to say that basically this is the career now, that the career path that you're on?
Oh, definitely.
How about you, David?
That's what it looks like right now.
Well, as you deal with this kind of career path, do you think your education had much to do with it? You mentioned the high school and the senior year, but what about college? Did that focus you some more? What impact did college have for you, David?
Well, yeah, it was, of course, a strong influence, as I'm sure as most folks who go to college. I majored in political science as well as journalism, and the assignment I have now really blends the two academic disciplines pretty well. I have it gave me a better handle on how politics works, and covering politics with what I learned in journalism is a great combination.
Well, Annie, for you, it sounds like actually while you were in school and college, you weren't focusing on journalism, so the question really has to be a little different. Do you think your academic background has given you some particular capability, other than, you know, taking English courses, learning how to write? Were there some angles to your education that you now think that you can draw on other than general background information?
Well, I think most of my undergraduate work was in English literature and French literature, and all I did was read novels and write papers on them. So having the ability to take a vast amount of information, several hundred pages, whether it be a report, a budget, whatever, and pick out the key points, I think that critical analysis and drawing that out of, you know, a press conference, an interview, like I said, a budget, those skills I think I learned through my undergraduate work.
As part of your process of training and growth as a journalist, are you seeking out different kinds of assignments, or do you just kind of go with the flow at any given time? How's that work for you?
Well, right now I'm on a pretty big learning curve. Unlike Dave, this is his third session. This is my first session. I've spent the last 3.5 years pretty much covering City Hall for the paper, and so after 3 years you pretty much know it like, you know, like the back of your hand. So right now I'm on a big learning curve, so I'm just trying to do anything and everything and learn from Dave and from editors who have covered the legislature before. So I'm just trying to keep abreast from day to day, but hopefully as I become more comfortable with the beat, I'll be able to take on some different types of stories and issues.
Well, David, you've already gone through your learning curve. At least you've been
Never
around
ends,
the count.
actually.
You could say that for all of us, I think. In terms of the process now, are there some other things you want to be doing, or are you? Is this a good point for you to be at covering politics in the Capitol, that sort of thing?
Yeah, actually, it's a sort of a sideways answer is covering the legislature, especially as far as covering other things. You find that between covering the legislative session and then you go into the campaigns and then you're right back into another session, that I guess if there was one thing I'd really like, it would be more of an opportunity to get outside of sort of a beat where your assignments are so dictated by the events that you cover, and be able to do more enterprising stories. But that's just a real challenge, I guess, with any reporting assignment, is to break away from covering what's happening and trying to do more enterprising work. So.
Well, do you ever get, or do you ever plan on taking like a couple of weeks off and going somewhere and just writing out of your own desire to cover something and then submit that as a possible story? Does that ever come to mind?
You have opportunities to really make a proposal to your editors to set some time aside. We have to publish 7 days, and you only have so many reporters, so there's a real challenge or a real pressure to maintain the daily production. And so you try to make a proposal where you have an opportunity to do a little bit of both and hopefully end up with a good package in the end. So.
How about you, Annie? Have you had that desire or opportunity to do something while traveling or whatever, and then make some, develop some reportage out of it?
Yeah, for example, a couple years ago I really wanted to go to the inauguration, and I was kind of swept up in, you know, the whole political change that happened when Clinton won the presidency, and so I made a proposal that I would go back there basically on my own time, pay my own ways, and, you know, cover the inauguration in terms of an Oregonian's perspective. And the paper, you know, bought off on that, and so I was able to do that, take a few days and do that. It wasn't a lot of writing because the pace was so fast that you just keeping up with the daily grind of getting stories in the paper with the time difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. But that was one situation where I was able to do that.
You just made me flash onto something when you mentioned the inauguration and the coverage. In 1972, when I went to the National Democratic Convention in Miami Beach as a Democratic delegate from Virginia, I also was working at the time for the Northern Virginia Sun newspaper, and I went down to and then he suddenly said, well, since you're going as a delegate, and I've been working for them off and on as a freelancer, and for a while I've been basically a stringer, they had me send back coverage, photos and the like. But things were moving so fast, you almost had to shift it to, well, when am I a delegate? When am I going to send something back? Of course, in those days, when you sent stuff back, you found someone hopping on a flight to go from Miami Beach to, you didn't have all the transmission facilities unless you were fancy like the AP and they had wire services. But when you do things like that, do you find that it sort of tunes you in more to the business side, or does it tune you more into, well, I'm still enjoying this and I'm able to absorb it? Does it change your mindset at all?
In terms of being a journalist?
Well, going to the inauguration, and you're there, you're trying to cover it, but you also want to participate. How does that affect you? Can you enjoy it as much?
Yes, because I think being one thing that we're fortunate about as being part of the media is that you often have a front row seat to events of history, and you get a very different perspective because you have better access to the players, you have better access to background information, you have better access to just seeing something unfold in front of you. And so I think that gives you a bird's eye view that the general public doesn't have, and the reason that you have that is because you're playing this role in the media. And that's one of the things that I really like about the job, is you just get to see so many different, I've had so many experiences I would have never had were I computer programmer, not to put down computer programmers or anything, but where I, in a different profession where we didn't have access to the players and the people in the process.
How do you feel about that, David? Have you had that kind of chance to be participating? Well, tell us
It's
about it.
interesting you asked that. I actually enjoy being an observer and often being real close to events, as Annie says, sometimes of history, but with a certain agnosticism. You're not
You're not
swept
of
up
the
in
faith.
Right? And the more I'm in this profession, I find I'm more comfortable as an agnostic as far as observing politics. But I'm real comfortable being at just any event and not necessarily being a participant, but being able to observe and try to convey what's happening to to the readers of the newspaper. So.
It's interesting that you mentioned it, in fact, being an agnostic, that is one who does not profess a particular faith when it comes to politics. Does that help you in terms of your analysis? Because we could get swept up in the emotions of an issue if you feel strongly about it one way or another. Do you have to create something of a wall between your personal views and what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. I'll come home and talk politics with my wife, and when we're at home, it's just a different setting. And I might talk about it as far as sort of my more personal political views, but at work there's definitely a firewall there that's been created over the years, and it's really not a problem at all to maintain that more analytical approach. If anything, I think it's generally for journalists, I think they tend, if they do have a bias, to overcompensate and to be that much more scrutinizing when they're assessing something that they might personally have some attachment to make sure that they're bending over backwards not to display any favoritism in the coverage they provide.
Well, Annie, what do you think about that? Do you have to build a firewall for yourself, too?
Definitely, definitely. And it's funny because, I'll do the same thing. I think we all go home and vent to our spouses. And my husband will say sometimes when I tell him about a story, he'll say, well, okay, how about the other side? You didn't just write that one side in your story, did you? And I said, well, no, of course I didn't do that, But you definitely, it's a completely different, you really just have to steel yourself almost and just submerge those personal feelings, especially on some very, key or strong issues that maybe you feel very strongly about. But it gets easier as time goes on. I mean, it's just part of the process. You're a professional. It's expected of you. You expect it of yourself. And it's just, you just deal with it.
I find it interesting that you've both mentioned this firewall because, for instance, I've dealt with you actually going back to the times you were at the state fairgrounds. There was some issue about development out there, and I remember you were covering it. And I've worked with you for 3 sessions now. And, I could not tell you off the bat what your political views are on just about anything, which probably speaks well of your professionalism. I can't discern that. And that's good in the sense of objectivity and reporting, as opposed to Ron Blankenbaker, who is a commentator and gets to throw his views all over the newspaper. Right. But politicians seem to have a different role. Now, we have to do just the opposite. We have to be espousing our viewpoint or presenting our viewpoint all the time. In fact, it's considered, chicken if you hold back or if you won't take a position. How do you deal with that when you're dealing with folks at the Capitol and trying to draw opinions out and you're trying to be neutral, but to some extent, do you play devil's advocate? What do you do to get a politician to own up? I'll let you start, Dave.
A lot of times I'll just say, hey, I'm just playing devil's advocate, and then I'll go in and try to draw out some kind of a reaction. You don't want to be perceived within the Capitol as a partisan on issues, as, oh, he's a liberal reporter or he's one of those conservatives who won't give public employees a fair shake or what have you. But you do find yourself playing devil's advocate and make sure they know that it's not necessarily your faith, but you're playing the role of a reporter and really trying to prod your sources for a response. So.
How about you, Annie?
That's pretty much the same way I handle it, too. I mean, I will point blank say to sources, what would your opponent say about this? Or just play devil's advocate and then I'll pose a question. But I always try and also ask them what their opponents would criticize about this or what the flaws in a piece of legislation are, so that gives me some insight as well. And then, of course, you always are going to the other side to find out what darts they're throwing at the opposition.
I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm the host for this program. Our guests today are two folks from the Statesman Journal, David Steeves, he's a reporter, and also Annie Athon, I pronounced it right this time. She's also a reporter for the Statesman Journal. If at any time you have any questions or concerns or comments that you'd like to share, please write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We'd be happy to hear from you. Picking back up on dealing with politicians, and do you have certain things that you like about how some people respond to you and some things that you don't like? I'll let you pick up on that, Dave.
Well, as a reporter, we have certain needs in getting, getting the stories in the paper. We have deadlines to meet, and hopefully politicians or anybody in the building who we use as sources would be sensitive to that. We treat them fairly, try to accurately portray what their comments and views are, and hopefully they'll be available. Access is something you hear about all the time in the Capitol, and for us, access means being available for interviews to clarify things that we may not be completely clear on. Rather make those things clear before we go to press than afterwards. And so being available, access is really something that we count on to get good, accurate coverage in the paper.
Well, Annie, have you had difficulty in tracking down some people? Do you have access problems with some politicians?
Not really. I found that it's pretty easy, and then being at the Capitol is such an advantage. We have a bureau there in the Capitol, and it's so easy because even if somebody's trying to stall you or avoid you, you can always catch them in the halls when they're going to or from session or committee meetings, and that's a real advantage, is because you're there. And I found that that's really been a key to learning how to cover the Capitol in the few months I've been there.
Well, the public's image is of the reporter chasing, of course they always think of the media reporter with the microphone
Right.
and the camera, or the pad, the steno pad and the pen, chasing after the politician who's waving them off saying, no comment, no comment, but what about this or what about that? Are you ever in a situation like that where someone's just trying to avoid you, physically rushing away?
Very rarely. It hardly ever happens. As we were talking about this, an image came to mind, though, when former State Senator Peg Jolin was in her last days as a member of the legislature, having been convicted of a felony. A lot of pressure for her to resign. One thing that's unique and that I really appreciate about the Oregon legislature is that reporters are allowed on the floors of the House and the Senate. When I covered Congress briefly about 4 years ago for a wire service, you sat on a gallery on the second floor looking down. You had hardly any access to members. Here you do have an opportunity to pose questions to them. They're coming onto the floor. They've got to walk out the doors to get to their office at the end of the floor session. And so at least you have an opportunity to pose those questions. And that's probably one of the rare instances where it was one of those no comments, I don't want to talk to you. But at least we had an opportunity to seek some kind of a response from that senator. So.
How about you, Annie? Have you had those kinds of situations arise?
Once or twice at City Hall at the Capitol. I had one instance, as a matter of fact, last week where a representative didn't want to talk about a bill and reasons behind it, the illegal immigration bill. And it was like trying to squeeze blood out of a turnip. And finally, the representative just walked away and said, I really don't want to talk to you about this. So, that leaves us in a very difficult position because we're just trying to portray as accurately as possible the reasons behind why a bill was introduced, because it's not always in black and white in the language of the bill. And as you know, as an attorney, the language of the bill is often full of legalese and things that aren't immediately accessible that could be interpreted a million different ways. And so it's very important for us to be able to clarify things.
Are you often, go ahead.
I did want to add one other thing. Rarely do you find a politician, a legislator who wants to play the role of the embattled legislator. Our relationship with most legislators, including yourself, is much better than that. We don't really have to chase them around. And they understand, they're professionals. They understand that they don't want to be quoted as, had no comment, refused to answer questions. So And politicians are very skilled at giving non-answer answers if that's what serves them best without avoiding the press altogether. So,
Do you get a lot of those non-answer answers?
it's just the nature of the process. You come back with other questions, hopefully you'll get some kind of an answer. So,
Annie, how about you? Do you have a method that you use to try to draw some information out when somebody is not quite cooperating or doesn't seem to be fully forthcoming?
Well, it's kind of like sales. You know, you never ask questions that can just be a yes or no answer. You try and get at the why and the reasoning behind, and to pose your questions in such a way that it's not just going to be an open shut yes or no, that you can either ask a follow-up question, or the way you phrased your question is going to invite a longer, more thoughtful response from the person you're asking. So there is kind of a technique in the way you ask questions or phrase it. And I don't have any problem saying, you know, that really wasn't quite what I was getting at. And I'll try and pose the question another way, or say, you know, you haven't answered that question yet. You know, and I'll just keep coming back to it in the interview. And then finally I'll just try and pin them down. You know, I'm getting the feeling you really don't want to answer that. Is this true? Or, you know, you just try and softball it for a while, but you need your question answered.
Do you ever find yourselves in a situation, and I'll ask you this first, David, where you're trying to get, well, you're getting a response, but somebody trips up? I know a couple of days ago I was talking to a reporter, and I referred to someone who enervates other people, and I started to think, wait a minute, was I saying the right? He says, did you mean energized? I said, yes, I mean energized. I mean, obviously the reporter wasn't trying to trip me up,
right.
But where sometimes you hear someone misspeak and perhaps you need to give them a cue to, did you mean to say something else, just to get it right in terms of a description?
Oh, sure. I mean, you know, that happens. Language isn't used with the greatest precision by most people, including legislators. So that's a relatively minor issue. I mean, quotes are great to have, and when they make sense, that's fine. And so it's not a great quote that you can use in a story. That's not a big deal. Usually we'll make sure we understand what our sources are saying rather than just try to do a gotcha on a piece of bad grammar. So.
Well, what do you do in terms of schedule? Annie, I'm curious about how you have to schedule yourself to, say, handle the legislature when we're in session. You've got deadlines and all that. What kind of schedule would you follow?
Just in terms of my work hours?
Your daily routine, that kind of thing?
I'm usually in the Capitol between 8:30 and 9. And gosh, Dave and I leave anywhere between 6:30, 6:30, and one night I was there till 10.
Now, you work for a morning paper, so you've
Right.
got some earlier deadlines. What kind of deadlines do you have in the afternoon or evening to get
Actually, we can really go up to, gosh, 10 or 11 o'clock.
So it's, in terms of the production of the paper, you've got other folks who are working other beats that are working, say, in the evening anyway. So
Right.
your deadline time is less of a problem than theirs.
Right.
Is that
Right, yeah. Occasionally I was covering a forum recently, an evening forum on public employee issues, and I was writing it right up to about 11:30 to hit deadline and stuff got in the paper. Literally minutes later it's rolling off the press, and you can look at the first edition and see what you just sent to the editor, and it'll fly through the process and get into the paper that quickly. But mainly folks who are covering police beats, they want to go right up to the last minute to make sure you don't miss an important public safety event. People who cover night meetings, those are the main ones that are there, you know, sort of pushing right up to deadline to get the stories in.
You ever get the shakes with the deadline? Oh gosh, I gotta get this done. Or
Yeah, I debated whether I really wanted to go get that cup of coffee that would just make me more jittery. I was jittery enough trying to hit my deadline last night. So,
how do you feel about deadlines, Annie?
I really got schooled with deadlines by covering the city council for 3 years, because they meet every other week, Monday nights. And so every other Monday I was on deadline. And so that really, I was nervous at first, and I was always sending from the city council chambers to the paper, so you had to deal with the technology in hopes that there would be no glitches. There was that concern. But my strategy is always to write as much as you can in advance. You can write, if you're writing an 8-inch story, 4 inches of background before you even get to the meeting. And then you just got to write a lead and a few quotes from the meeting and any changes, you know, that may have occurred in whatever you're covering, and you can basically go. So deadline doesn't really get to me. It kind of drives me. I like the pressure cooker environment of this business. I don't think you can succeed in this business very long if you don't like the day-to-day grind and the adrenaline rush almost every day.
Well, as far as that preparation goes, in essence, then you know what the issues are that are coming up, so you can start prepping that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, now, in terms of the different characters you have to deal with in this now in the political process around the Capitol, I assume that you've got different levels of intellectual content or capability. You've got different types of personalities. How do you deal with those variety of people? Do you care to comment on, I mean, without naming names, perhaps, of the types of characters you have to deal with?
Just among legislators, let's
Sure.
say? Oh, I suppose the range is you do have some people who they're not really engaged in the process all that closely. They're in jargon sort of backbenchers, and you tend not to seek them out so much just because they're not going to have that much credence in what they say. They're not that engaged in the process. You have some who are very quotable. They're not necessarily up on everything, but you can count on a real good, succinct analysis. And since quotes do liven up a story, you look for them. Folks who are in leadership positions, House Speaker, Senate President, majority, minority leaders, regardless of their personality, their quotability, I mean, they're leaders, and they hopefully got their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in that building and the big decisions. So you'll go to them, and within that group, you'll have different personalities, and you really, you take what you can get. So,
how about you, Andy? Do you have that same kind of approach?
Yeah, it's been interesting because I truly have come to understand the phrase citizen legislature since I've been here, because it's very interesting. You have some politicians who are very polished and very savvy with the process, and some who have their handlers, and you have to go through the appropriate channels to get access sometimes. And then you have others who are completely at the other end of the spectrum, who, like Dave said, don't seem that engaged in the process, or that up, maybe even on their own legislation, their name's on it. And sometimes you're reading the bill to them saying, now, is this right? And you say, oh, was that in there? So sometimes you run into that. And so I've truly come to understand what the citizen legislature means, and yet you hear that term over and over again from all different parts of the system, from lobbyists, from legislators, from citizens, and that seems to be what Oregonians want, and so it's really what they have.
Switching gears a bit, David, do you prepare your stories in terms of using the facilities at the Capitol and transmit them by modem, or how do each of you physically produce a story when you're ready?
That's pretty much how. We have a bureau that we pay rent for in the basement of the Capitol, and we've got phone lines. We have a PowerBook portable PC that we can occasionally take to meetings throughout the building, and you can type notes into it, work on your story like Annie was talking about when she covered City Hall. Sit down, plug it into the phone, and send. Sometimes, and Annie has a slightly different approach, you can go to the station. We're the only newspaper where you have a bureau, and then 4 blocks away you have your main newspaper office with all the resources, a library, or a morgue as it's called in the business, to look up old clips, reference materials. So working for the Statesman, you've got the best of both worlds.
I'm curious, Annie, in terms of how you work with legislators, we only have about a minute left, and is there something you would want to tell politicians and legislators about what they ought to do to better relate to the press or anything like that?
I guess my words of advice, as Dave kind of pretty much mentioned, is be accessible and be sensitive to the deadline pressures that we're under. And above all, be honest.
Well, David, picking up on that, do you have any words of advice for readers in terms of what they should look for in trying to read between the lines and discern things in stories?
Well, that's a tough question. Hopefully we spell things out so there isn't too much reading between the lines to be done, but more and more the Statesman, a lot of papers are trying to give information on how you can be involved directly, so we'll be mentioning when a committee hearing is going on, and those things are always helpful for using the newspaper to engage yourself as a citizen in the process.
Well, with that, I thank both of you for engaging yourselves in Capitol Insight. I'll thank our viewers for joining us on this program, and I invite you to engage yourselves in the political process. Read about it in the Statesman Journal. Thanks to David Steves and Annie Athon. I'll pronounce your name right. Thanks for joining us on Capitol Insight.
Sure.